Get started with your uh, with your notes for today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Japan and feudalism, and then kind of the unifying of Japan after feudalism during the time period 1450 to 1750. But since we haven't really talked about Japan yet, I'm going to have to go back and kind of give you some background, some context to what's going on in Japan during this time. Since you've read about them, but I need to give some context into what all is going on here. Okay, so so first we're going to talk about the characteristics and causes of Japanese feudalism, because that is what leads us into this time period, and that's kind of at the beginning in 1450. That's the government system they have going on, government and economic system they have going on at this time, and then we'll go into what happens to the feudal system afterwards. All right, so let's start with the geography of Japan. So Japan is a series of islands off the coasts of Korea and China. So you've got, let me use my pointer here. You've got Korea here, you've got China here. Japan is right off here. They had adopted Chinese culture or in the Sinification before this time periods, and then they also adopt Indian religion, which we'll get to in a second. But like Greece, Japan was divided by mountains, and they had few areas for farming. And we saw in Greece, and we've seen in other places after that, like the Aztecs, that if you're separated geographically, you're going to have a more kind of spread out governmental system as well, which we'll see in a second. They had few areas for farming. Mostly, lots of mountains in Japan. Before 400 AD, Japan was not a unified nation, but was ruled by hundreds of different family clans, and clan-based states, you could say. So Japan's island location provided protection from the Chinese and Mongol invasions. So China had not been able to invade them. The Mongols tried, but were not able to invade Japan. But Japan was close enough to borrow cultural ideas from China. They borrowed a lot of things from China. That Sinification or Chinification, what we called it, that they began to be more like China as things progressed, and as they kind of changed their culture, as Japan changed their culture and adopted things from other places. They became more like China and adopted some of the same things. Okay. All right. Japan's isolation, then being isolated on an island and isolation through these mountains, gave rise to a unique Japanese culture, most specifically the Shinto religion. So they have this religion, Shinto. It's a polytheistic religion based on the respect of nature and ancestor worship. So you might see some similarities to Confucianism or Buddhism in this. And Shinto worshippers believed in divine spirits called kami that live in nature. And the most important of the Shinto gods is the sun goddess, who gave light to the world. Her name is Amaterasu. Okay, she's the sun goddess, gave light to the world, and she's the most important of these Shinto gods. In the mid 700s, Buddhism was introduced in Japan from China and Korea. So Buddhism comes in from China and Korea. And Buddhism was accepted by the Japanese emperors, but in Japanese society, Buddhism and Shinto blended. This is an example of syncretism, where you have religions or parts of culture blending into each other. So an example of religious blending, an example of syncretism, was called Zen Buddhism. So Zen Buddhism is a blending of Shinto and Buddhism into a new religion, syncretism. Or syncretism is it's an example of syncretism. Zen Buddhism is what this is called. Okay. From 794 to 1185, Japan entered a classical era during the Heian period. The Heian period is considered like kind of the classical age of Japan. So if the classical China would be like the Qin and the Han. So Japan had the Heian period, where a lot of the kind of the background and the background of their culture was developed during this time. The imperial government was strong during this time as well. Japan experienced an era of peace and prosperity, and Japan developed a golden age in poetry, art, and literature. So a lot of their common cultural aspects were kind of built during this time. And one of those is a piece of literature called The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. And this is kind of the classic work of Japanese literature. I read it in college, and I don't remember much about it because I should have been paying more attention at that time. But it was it's kind of the classic work of Japanese literature, and that was during the Heian period as well. By the mid 1000s, the imperial government grew weak. Regional landowners gained more power, and Japan became lawless and dangerous. So the imperial government's getting weaker. The emperors don't have as much power. Regional landowners gain power. This may seem familiar to something that's happened in other places where regional landowners gain power. We call them lords a lot of times, and this is an example of feudalism. So Japan, the imperial government's getting weaker. Landowners are gaining power. The landowners are kind of the ones that make a lot of the decisions. You could call them lords, but there's another name that we'll talk about for them. But this is the same sort of system that Europe has under their feudal system. It's basically the same thing, except it's happening in Japan around the same time, a little bit afterwards. So outlaws attacked farmers and pirates attacked the coast. And there's a lot, again, lawless and dangerous stuff going on. Not really following laws, and lots of war. Rival clans competed for power and threw Japan into a series of civil wars. And as a result, Japan developed this feudal system. And this, you might recognize this social pyramid, which we'll come back to many times to talk about different, how society is set up. Usually fewer people at the top and a large number of people at the bottom, kind of like a pyramid. So farmers traded their land to strong warlords called daimyo, who offered protection. So the daimyo protect the farmers. They're the warlords, okay? Warlords, same thing, daimyo, okay? These are the lords. They own the land, and the farmers are working for the lords because the farmers have given their land to these lords in exchange for protection. Now, how do the daimyo protect them? It's because it can't just be the daimyo themselves. The daimyo were served by loyal warriors called samurai. Okay, you've probably heard of samurai before. So the samurai are like the knights in European feudalism. Now, as far as I know, they didn't really, they didn't ride horses like you think of knights doing. I'm sure some of them did, but the samurai were the warriors. They served the daimyo, and just like in Europe, they're given a little piece of the daimyo's land in exchange for being part of the daimyo's kind of private army. So the samurai are kind of acting as the knights would be in European feudalism. Okay, Now the emperor had little power. Again, just like in Europe, where the kings had little power, the emperor had very little power at this point, and wasn't able to. I mean, yeah, he's in charge, but he doesn't have that much real power. Samurai warriors were usually relatives or dependents of the daimyo. So they're their children, they're people under their care that are related to them. Although some were hired warriors, and these were called ronin. Some of y'all might have seen a movie about ronin before. So the ronin were hired warriors, kind of the mercenaries to to that were loyal to the daimyo and worked for the daimyo in exchange for land. Samurai warriors lived by a code of Bushido, kind of like the code of chivalry in European feudalism. There's lots of similar things here. And the code of Bushido demanded courage, loyalty, deity, fairness, and honor. Okay, so you've got a code of conduct for these samurai warriors, and this is called Bushido. Okay, samurai were also skilled swordsmen, but they used, and there we go, I forgot about that. They used horses and guns after the arrival of Europeans. So Europeans kind of started trading with Japan. So after Europeans started trading with Japan, that's when they have horses and and guns that use gunpowder. But they started off as skilled swordsmen, kind of like you think of as the samurai. Okay. All right. In 1192, the first shogun was named by the emperor, and the shogun was was a military ruler. Okay, the emperor remained in place, but the shogun held real power, and he ruled. The shogun held all the real power, and they ruled as military dictators. Okay, so there's a shogun under the emperor that's a military leader, and they kind of have all the real power because they control the military. So the emperor is the kind of official leader, but they name a shogun to kind of rule in their place. The interesting thing about Japan is is that since the beginning of the Japanese emperors, um, they have never had an overthrow of the government. So you have different dynasties in China, and in all the kingdoms of Europe, you have all these, you have a new ruling family, um, and stuff like that. There's new families take over every once in a while, and you have again different dynasties there too. Uh, but but in Japan, the emperor today is a direct descendant of the first emperor, and it's believed, and this is probably the reason it's done this for so long, is it's believed in Japan that the emperor is a descendant of the sun, a descendant of the sun god. Um, so so if you're a descendant of the sun god, that gives you that legitimacy that we talked about last unit. That legitimizes your power, and makes it. If he's a descendant of the sun god, then he must be the one that's supposed to rule. So even when the emperor isn't a very strong leader, or the people don't like the emperor can kind of put a shogun in place to be the actual leader when he's the ruler in name only, as it says there. But the shogun is kind of the one with all the real power, and that can be chosen based on whoever would be the best ruler, rather than just who who they're who they're a descendant of. Um, all right, so shogun's power varied over time, uh, but the pattern of government controlled by a shogun lasted until 1867. So there are some shoguns that are less powerful, some shoguns are more powerful, but this pattern of government lasted until 1867 with the last shogun. Uh, so so then we're going to go into the three unifiers, uh, and the role they played in unifying Japan. So we're going to talk about Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. which are those are the three unifiers of Japan. So from from 1560 to 1600, three powerful daimyo, known as the three unifiers, began to restore order and unify Japan. Okay, so so these are very powerful daimyo. One of them becomes shogun and unifies Japan. But but they start as warlords. They start as landowners and just very powerful and have their own private armies and that sort of thing. And they start unifying Japan once again instead of being in this feudal system. So let's start with Oda. So in 1568, a brutal daimyo named Oda Nobunaga conquered the Japanese capital of Kyoto. Okay, so he conquered Kyoto, which was the capital of China at the time, and he starts kind of building his unified empire. Now it's not complete yet, not by a long shot, but he's starting that around 1568. Oda seized power by force. He was the first to use guns effectively. So again, the Europeans had traded in gunpowder and these rifles, and he seized power using that. He eliminated his Buddhist rivals that refused to accept rule by the emperor, and he kind of started to unify Japan, trying to unify Japan under the emperor, but with him, having the real power here. By the time of his death in 1582, Japan was not unified, and you start to see you start to see that it's going to be very hard to unify. It's going to be very hard to unify Japan by that point. But somebody comes afterwards, and that is a guy by the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Okay. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was Oda Nobunaga's best general, okay, and he took over after Oda's death. By the way, Japanese, like Chinese names, the name that comes first is actually the family name. So Oda is like if we called him by his last name, like if you called me Park because that's my last name. Oda is like his last name because it's his family name. Nobunaga would be like his first name, because it's his chosen name that doesn't have to do with his family. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi took over after Oda's death. So Toyotomi, this is like his last name. Toyotomi was resourceful and not ruthless like Oda. He used political alliances, adoption, and marriage to gain power over the daimyo. And this is another thing that's super interesting about Japan is if the emperor is descended from the sun god, and there's always been the same line of emperors, then the way to gain power is not to overthrow the emperor, because that would be the first time that's ever happened, and that would be terrible, and you wouldn't have that legitimacy of being descended from the sun god anymore. So how do you gain power in Japan? Well, you either get named shogun, which is possible, but then the other way to gain power for your family is to marry in to the emperor's line. So you can gain a lot of power over other people by saying, hey, my daughter is married to the emperor, and then your kids, the next ones will be half your family, and you can continue that from there. So the next emperor has half of your bloodline, and then you can marry into that, and then the next emperor has more of your bloodline, and we don't do this today, but that's how things were done back then. You use marriage to gain power for your family. Your family is in charge, both in name and in actual rule. So Toyotomi used some of these political alliances, adopting other daimyo's children, using marriage to gain power over other daimyo, using marriage to marry into the emperor's line, and those sorts of things. By 1590, Toyotomi Hideyoshi controlled most of Japan and tried unsuccessfully to conquer Korea. So they try to conquer Korea, it doesn't work. Uh, so they have by 1590 most of Japan. There's this little portion right here, this little gray portion that is not unified yet. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi almost completes the unification of the island of Japan by the time he died in 1590. Okay. Oh, whoops, sorry. I guess that was he he died in 1598. He completed he kind of reached the peak of his territorial power in 1590. So after Toyotomi's death in 1598, one of his daimyo allies named Tokugawa Ieyasu completed the unification of Japan in 1600. Tokugawa Ieyasu is able to fully unify Japan, the entire island, get everyone under his rule, and everyone under the emperor's rule in name only, right? In 1603, Tokugawa became shogun of Japan. He's named shogun by the emperor, and he moved the capital to Edo. Edo is later called Tokyo, which is the capital of Japan today. So he moves the capital to Edo, which becomes Tokyo, and he restored government and order to Japan. So you've unified Japan into one country, just like it is today. The whole collection of islands, and and he is the ruler now, not the emperor, because the emperor is still in charge, but he has all the real power in Japan, starting off as a daimyo, working his way up, conquering all this territory, and unifying it into one empire, and then named shogun by the emperor. So Tokugawa ruled until 1615, but he created a line of succession called the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan until 1867. So his line of shoguns ruled ruled Japan until, or for the next 250 years, until 1867. So for more than 250 years, Tokugawa's successors ruled Japan as shoguns. I just said that. And during this time, Japan benefited from peace. The economy boomed and it became more commercial. So you don't have all these wars between daimyo anymore. You can focus more on the economy. You can do a lot more trade. All those things are really helpful for the state. European merchants and missionaries first arrived in Japan in the mid 1500s. Again, so this is happening before Tokugawa even takes over. So they've already kind of started the process of trading with Europe. And Tokugawa enjoyed trade with the Europeans, and he was fascinated to learn about their military, their new technologies, their new ideas. Right? It was because of gunpowder that line had taken, or that had gained so much power. Anyway, so he loves European technology. He likes their ideas. Learns a lot from the Europeans, right? Europeans probably weren't as weren't wanting to learn as much from the Japanese, but that's just a quirky thing going on there. They probably could have learned a lot from the Japanese, but before 1549 and between 1549 and 1600, when Tokugawa really kind of takes over in 1600, European missionaries had converted 300,000 Japanese to Christianity. So Tokugawa takes over a Japan that has hundreds of thousands of Japanese Christians. Now, Christianity is not traditionally part of Japan. So there's a kind of culture clash going on here. This upset Tokugawa because the missionaries ignored Japanese cultural beliefs and laws, and they didn't follow the laws. They didn't follow traditional Japanese culture. So that has this clash, and there's lots of tension there. In 1612, Tokugawa bans Christianity, and he began ruthlessly persecuting Christians because of the way the Japanese were not following the missionaries were not following their laws, and they weren't they weren't following traditional Japanese culture. So he wanted to preserve that culture and preserve their laws. And so he banned Christianity and began persecuting Christians in Japan. Here you can see the way they executed Christians in Japan. Ironically, this is on purpose, symbolically by cross, because playing off of Jesus's death, and oops. Uh, Later, Tokugawa shoguns decided to exclude foreign merchants and missionaries. So they not only banned Christianity, but they didn't want later shoguns after Tokugawa, his descendants, didn't want to allow these merchants and missionaries into their country at all. So by 1639, Japan adopted a closed country policy and ended almost all foreign contacts. They didn't want anyone to come into their country, and because they wanted to preserve this Japanese culture. So one Japanese port at Deshima in Nagasaki Bay remained open, but it was only open to Dutch and Chinese merchants. That only the Dutch and the Chinese could trade, and only at this one port in Japan. That's it. No one else could trade with Japan, and their trade was limited to this one port, so that their cultural beliefs wouldn't really spread to all these other places in Japan. So Japanese isolation remained in place for over 200 years until the 1850s. During this era of isolation, Japan had profitable trade. They became self-sufficient, meaning they had all their own. They were able to have all their own resources. They limited foreign ideas, and they reduced Europe's ability to colonize Japan. So they have a very traditional culture, very specific culture that's unique to Japan, and they've limited these foreign ideas from being able to come in and change their culture. And Europe does not colonize Japan like they do in China, that we'll get to later, like they do India. Europe does not colonize Japan in the same way, so that kind of changes, keeps Japan similar to the way it was, back in the 1500s and 1600s. All right. That's all we have for today. So that is all you need to know. I will let you know about what you're doing next, so you can go on to your next lesson, and I will talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good day.